but I never got out.
We're busy. Union business.
Yeah, no, I mean, like,
And I said, look, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll put some money down for that fence. Years ago. But I mean, it was frank. It was,
a very close friend of mine.
Okay.
Different person.
Okay.
So I have his take on it.
That rural urban.
I think that's something I've realized. By the way, where's the source when you mentioned Soleil's right on the Ponderland O'Brien?
It's co-edited volume by a guy. Teachers of Toronto.
The music library.
He has got a book on
Yes, no, I have David also, like, I think it's maybe that one. I found some very interesting material in the archives because I was looking for some stuff on the docs and everything. I came across crazy things which I don't think which was an internal commission inquiry by the police into what went wrong.
Such a big stage.
When I get back. It's like a nice view. It's a nice view. That room, like a hospital. It's so nice.
It looks almost exactly like this.
It is, exactly. You don't have this, you just and I'm still going to be with this one.
Obviously not enough information in the show, so they've been very well handled.
Right. And
Oh, wow. That was like, is everyone just like really like in sync with the club?
yeah, which I'm not like convincing you to start with.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Oh yeah.
Because kind of like the Irish, right?
That's their very typical.
So very arguably one of actually like best
Defend Africa as a country now. You go directly at bat. First, close to
like channeling people to like pretty easy, quick money, but like not stuff that's going to kind of like create bourgeoisie. That sort of stuff. Like rare things to do.
Okay, thanks everyone, and welcome to people who are just joining us for this keynote. I'm really excited to have Will Shoki, who is the editor of Africa as a Country, here to speak to us. I've known Will quite a while, and I'm really excited that he's here. He's one of the more brilliant young minds of South Africa. He doesn't want me to say it, but it's true. And I'm really, really glad that he's here. I think it's really great because Trevor last night, when he ended his keynote, had a picture on the slide that said everything must fall, which is very useful because the title of William's talk tonight is Everything Must Fall But What Must Rise. So I think that's some really nice linking between these. And the subtitle is The Unsettled Legacy of the Student Challenge to ANC Hegemony. Without further ado, over to Will.
Thank you very much, Carolee. Thank you to the Watson Institute, to Dan, Patrick, and Christine for getting me up here. It's a real tremendous honor and privilege to be in this room with all of you. The great advantage of speaking at the end of the day is that you benefit from the rich insights, contributions of people much smarter than you. And the great disadvantage of speaking at the end of the day is that you follow on from the rich insights and contributions of people much smarter than you. So I find myself in a position where I'm kind of double taking some of the claims I thought I would have made this afternoon in lieu of what everyone has said earlier. So as Carolee has mentioned, the title of my keynote, which is not so much a keynote, I'm going to be following in the spirit of the previous panel. It's sort of a set of disorganized remarks and reflections, but it's Everything Must Fall and What Must Rise. And the impetus of me choosing the subject is when I was approached by Watson to speak, I had reflected on the fact that this is a 30-year commemorative event on the post-apartheid period in South Africa. There are numerous commemorative events happening across the country and elsewhere. And one thing that I found alarmingly absent in these conversations is taking stock of the Fallist moment between 2015 and 2016. You heard Trevor yesterday speak about how this was a moment that really kind of gripped national attention because it felt as if South African students were now suddenly at the forefront of advancing social change and transformation. And that didn't happen. The movement came, the movement went, and there's been sort of uneven reflection on what was the social and historical significance of that period. And I don't claim to have the answer about what the social historical significance was of that period, but I think it's worth reflecting on what that might be. How is it the case that there was this mass mobilization of students across South African universities that now seems to have been a distant memory? When we speak about Fees Must Fall and Roads Must Fall, we speak of it as if it happened 20 years ago, not as if it occurred in 2015 and 2016. So what I think I'm going to touch on today is to understand when remembering and recalling and recounting the Fallist moment, typically there are two readings. One is a fairly inflationary reading that, in a sense, exaggerates perhaps the capacity that students felt at the time to pursue revolutionary change. Students were at the cusp of creating a real shake-up in South African politics and democracy, which is not what happened. And the other is a sort of derisory reading that kind of dismisses the efforts of students when mobilizing on campus, says the Fallist moment didn't really amount to anything, and it's something that we can now consign to the dustbin of history. I'm going to try and push against both readings and, sort of borrowing from a classic Marxian axiom, really try to come to grips with how people make their own history, but they don't do so in circumstances of their own choosing. And to think of the Fallist movement as conditioned by the defeat of the South African left and by the demobilization of the South African left and working class, which has been a recurring theme of this conference. So, as we all might recall, Roads Must Fall and Fees Must Fall were movements that developed on South African campuses in 2015. Roads Must Fall began at the University of Cape Town in April 2015 when a student by the name of Xumani Maqele took human feces and lunged it at the statue of Cecil John Rhodes that sat at the top of Upper Campus. The University of Cape Town, particularly Upper Campus, was built on land bequeathed by Cecil John Rhodes, and so students were calling attention to how the memorialization of Cecil John Rhodes was something that reinforced white supremacy, that alienated Black South African students, and that was indicative of the failure of universities to sufficiently transform and integrate Black South African students, and morphed into a mass protest movement that eventually was able to topple the statue of Rhodes in April of that year. It also migrated to Oxford, and in that same year, in 2015, we also saw the beginnings of a nationwide movement to protest against fee increases. The movement began at Wits in February of that year, when the SRC at the time tried to raise funds for students who were on the cusp of academic exclusion. There was engagement with the university that transpired throughout the remainder of that year. In October, preceding first a movement to end the outsourcing of workers, the October 6 movement, that graduated into a campaign to protest fee increases at the University of Witwatersrand, which then quickly spread to other universities across South Africa. The important thing to say here, though, is that this wasn't the first time that students on university campuses protested against economic exclusion. There's been long histories of protests of this nature which took place in historically black institutions. Brown University is not one of them. In South Africa, it included institutions such as TUT in Durban, Univen, other institutions in sort of more kind of rural, not necessarily rural, but sort of urban parts of South Africa that weren't Johannesburg and Cape Town, where Wits and UCT were located previously. So, I think what is remarkable about the Fallist movements is the way it captured and gripped national attention. As mentioned in the abstract that presents this keynote, typically when we think of South Africa, we think of protest movements that are limited to its poor and working class. We're the so-called protest capital of the world. And part of why this was so surprising is that here were students who might not have all hailed from middle-class backgrounds, but certainly were aspiring to that in obtaining university credentials, protesting against the post-apartheid political order, making a challenge to their political order, and claiming that the promise of socio-economic inclusion that the post-apartheid settlement presented was unfulfilled or belated. Now, why did that happen? Why was it students who suddenly in the mid-2010s were at the vanguard of social protests and were looked on as being perhaps the hopes of transforming a South Africa that up until that point remained deeply divided along race, class, and gender? The first sort of background factor that I think contextualizes the emergence of Fees Must Fall and Roads Must Fall as an independent movement is a theme that others have touched on throughout this conference, which is the historical defeat of South Africa's working class and the demobilization of the left. I won't get into this because I think it's been adequately covered throughout this conference, but I think what is important to note about the disorganization of the South African left, the decline of institutions such as the trade union movement, the decline of civic organizations, is that it rendered South Africa's working class largely illegible in the public sphere. What I mean by this is that South Africa's working class majority became so thoroughly marginalized that it was virtually absent from public discourse. The usual story presents Marikana as a moment that changed that, a moment which sort of made South Africans aware of the extreme deprivation faced by the majority of people, and that made South Africans aware to the ways in which this extreme deprivation was being protested, put the working class once again on the agenda of social discourse. However, that wasn't really actually the case. I think when we sort of rethink the NUMSA moment and the sort of sequence of events that follow from Marikana, which included the breakaway of NUMSA from the tripartite alliance, the formation of the economic freedom fighters on the Kopi where Marikana happened, we attribute to it a sort of outsized role in the way it shaped South Africans' perceptions of the post-apartheid government. A recent survey in 2021, for example, found that half of South Africans either did not know that Marikana happened or knew very little about it. And I think that's extremely telling. I think it's extremely telling to the degree to which working class South Africans were, and I'd argue till today, remain consigned to the peripheries of social discourse. So yes, we are the protest capital of the world, but most of these protests go unnoticed. Even if there are protests such as the mining strike that happened in 2012, occurred again in 2014, even if there are protests where an extraordinary, spectacular injustice, such as the killing of 34 miners, even when that happens, working class South Africans still occupy this peripheral position in the way the South African political landscape is understood. Which is why, when students protest, this becomes something that people take notice of. When it happens primarily at the University of Cape Town, when it happens at the University of the Witwatersrand, because this sort of upsets the traditional paradigm where it's not poor and working class black South Africans who are laying a challenge to the post-apartheid political settlement, but it's South African students, people who are more or less kind of in the middle of a class structure or aspiring to something beyond that. Be that as it may, the question is, emerging out of this void of working class organization, the student challenge to ANC hegemony still claimed to follow on from the lineage of working class protest and mobilization. As Trevor was saying yesterday, it claimed to follow on from the heritage of black consciousness. It claimed the likes of Frantz Fanon and Steve Biko as its theoreticians. It presented exclusion from tertiary campuses as primarily as a class issue in some senses. But it didn't do so whilst linking up with broader working class concerns and popular protests. This is a critique that Trevor himself has made, and I found very helpful in saying that what was noticeable about the student challenge is that it remained largely confined to the campus. Ordinarily, we understand that as a failing of students themselves. Students should have gone beyond the campus gates and linked up with popular mobilizations and protests. Students should have done more to connect their own struggle with the struggles that many South Africans face for housing, for water, so on and so forth. But the reality is students couldn't have. They couldn't have because their protest emerges in this void that is characterized by the stark defeat of the working class. South Africa's working classes at the time weren't organized. South Africa's working class at the time were largely condemned to a position of resignation where the left and its traditional structures that would have been the ordinary vehicle to give them visibility did not exist, and so they were largely invisible to the South African political imagination. And so I think that means that the student challenge was class-focused, but could never really become class-rooted. And in fact, even in that, discussions about class typically were refracted through other categories of social difference. They were understood on the terms of race, on the terms of gender, and so on and so forth. And I'm going to come back to this again as to why I think that is an insight into how we can think about South Africa's political discourse today. But the second thing to note here is that the real complaint of South African students at the time has something to do with the ANC's post-apartheid economic and political project. And I think, we've discussed how the ANC's class project was this program of trying to cultivate national bourgeoisie, black sort of elite. But at the same time, it did sort of roll out not enormously, but a modestly redistributive political program, and partly this involved the massification of higher education, the opening of doors to higher learning to millions of black South Africans that were previously closed. And in doing so, it engendered a belief in the South African public that the route to upward mobility was by going to university. That if you go to university and you have a university degree, that would be your ticket to a better life, not only for yourself, but also for your family, for the people that you left behind back home. And what became abundantly clear in the 2010s period of South Africa's history is that this model was unviable. The onset of the 2008 financial crisis, the contraction of the South African economy, the decline of the South African economy meant that the pie was shrinking, there wasn't enough to go around, and that the trajectory to upward social mobility could no longer be guaranteed by a university degree. South Africa has one of the highest unemployed graduate rates in the world. That going to university was no longer this security or source of security that could propel you towards a middle-class life. And so the students at the time occupied this position where, precisely because they were beneficiaries of the ANC's post-apartheid class project, their primary grievance was at how the terms of socio-economic inclusion did not match up with their expectations. That universities simply were no longer this place that could secure comfortable middle-class existence for the majority of people. And so largely, the battles that ensued on university campuses were directed at the university in many cases, but also at the state, at saying fee increases and this is perhaps the most compelling demand, the one that mobilized the greatest majority of students, that fee increases would prohibitively exclude the opportunity of South Africans to access higher education for students at the time who were enrolled, who had prospects of being enrolled from accessing higher education. What that simultaneously ignored, however, was the extent to which university education in South Africa remains a privilege. You know, millions of South Africans don't get this opportunity, and millions of South Africans can't relate to that particular paradigm. So the fees must fall and roads must fall protest comes on the back of the historic defeat of South Africa's working class, but it also comes on the back of neoliberal depoliticization, which is interrelated with the defeat of the working class. And it posed a challenge to the terms of that depoliticization, which manifested on the one hand in the ascendant triumphalist rainbow nationalist narrative, the idea that post-1994, South Africa was this multiracial democracy, that its reconciliatory processes, primarily the TRC, had sufficiently sort of mended the divisions that existed in society. That was the one thing. But the other thing was also the extent to which, like I mentioned earlier, the class project of the ANC was a viable class project. And students took aim at the rainbow nationalist narrative by calling attention to the persistence of racialized inequality, calling attention to how universities still remained these institutions that projected a colonial character, whose makeup in faculty was primarily white, whose curricula and syllabus was primarily Eurocentric, and so on and so forth. And so it challenged the extent to which South Africa, related to the rest of the globe, kind of entered into sort of this post-political, post-historical era where supposedly all of the divisions of the past had been healed and fixed, and students challenged that. Now, the question is, why did this challenge fizzle out as quickly as it did? Because fees have not fallen. A lot of South African institutions remain deeply sort of colonial, exclusionary, and so on and so forth. So how is it the case that this protest movement, which galvanized thousands of students across South African campuses, which captured the public imagination, how did it sort of kind of erupt into obscurity? And I think what is important to recognize here is the fact that this protest movement is conditioned itself by the political void that it was a response to. And I think here, South Africa is not unlike other parts of the world where in the 2010s, we see the renewed politicization of society that confronts the failures of capitalism and confronts the inability of capitalism at the time to deliver stable economic growth and economic opportunities to people. I think there's a tendency to almost exceptionalize the South African case and to sort of divorce it from other social mobilizations that were happening at the time in the 2010s, Occupy, the revolts in Egypt, the indignados in Spain, the Free Fair movement in Brazil, and so on and so forth. So I think it emerges in this period, in this interregnal period in the 2010s, in which we see the emergence of mass protests once again, that challenges the end of history thesis that took place in the 1990s and says, well, actually, capitalism sucks, basically. The problem, however, is that precisely owing to that period of depoliticization, the way that argument is articulated happens in a highly inchoate, uneven fashion, right? In the sense of, with fees must fall and roads must fall, you had this mobilization that was bringing attention to social difference, but still failed to arrive at the requisite class analysis which could name the social antagonisms that are definitive of South Africa's political order, that took primary recourse to identity and belonging as the terms through which to understand social antagonism in society. And so class was always in the background of the claims that students were making, but it was never at the foreground of what students were saying. And I think the Fallist moment in South African history could be helpfully understood through the use of the Iranian sociologist Asif Bayat's terminology of how it constituted a non-movement. And Bayat describes non-movements, just going to find the quote here. One second, it's a compelling quote, so I promise you it's worth the wait. So describing the political mobilizations characteristic of the interregnum, ones that have typically been structureless, chaotic, and with short lifespans, from the Arab Spring to Occupy, to Fees Fall to End SARS in Nigeria, Bayat describes them as non-movements, refers to the collective actions of non-collective actors. They embody the shared practices of large numbers of ordinary people whose fragmented but similar activities trigger much social change, even though these practices are rarely guided by an ideology or recognizable leaderships and organizations. So the non-movement then emerges as sort of the organizational form of a disorganized age. And the argument here is that Fees Must Fall and Roads Must Fall emerge at precisely the moment when the disorganization of the South African left of its traditional structures is manifest. And so there's always this kind of debate about, how come the South African left didn't play a bigger role to sort of capture the energies of the Fallist moment and nurture that into a sustained resistance to capitalism? Well, it's because I think the South African left was in a moribund position. I think Trevor's talk yesterday kind of addressed how this happened and how that marginality evolved. The question now is recognizing that the Fallist moment was sort of constrained by the historical circumstances that it found itself in. Is there anything there that remains? Is there a lesson to take away from that? Is there something that could be perhaps a glimmer of hope or an implication for the strategy and tactics for the South African left? And I think what I want to sort of provisionally argue, but I don't feel very strong about this claim now, is what is noteworthy about the Fallist moment, and I think about other similarly positioned mobilizations globally, is that it represents the politicization of the South African middle class. We see for the first time the middle class kind of emerge as an independent actor in South African politics, making claims upon the state and advancing its own sort of underdeveloped vision of social transformation. And that the 2010s period, sort of characterized, as Trevor went through yesterday, and it carries on to today, by state capture, by corruption, widening inequality, the incapacity of the state, became an igniting force for middle class politicization for the first time. What exactly this means for left strategy and tactics, I'm not sure, because the middle class operates in this contradictory class location, and its profile in South Africa is unclear. Is it the professional managerial strata? Is it small business owners? Who constitutes exactly the middle class in South Africa? I don't know. But I think what is clear is that they're now in a position of heightened politicization and must be treated theory as a social formation we're theorizing about. I'm not exactly sure how to go about that. And I think it's evident, looking ahead to the 2024 elections, that the middle class as a social base in South Africa, particularly the black middle class, is going to be decisive for the ability of political formations to try and seize and take power. The economic freedom fighters, which people were asking about yesterday, in large part owes its current membership to this sort of disgruntled, downwardly mobile, disenfranchised middle class. That's why sort of in the 2010s period, lots of students kind of flocked to the EFF, believed it to be this party that could speak to the grievance of South Africa's black middle class. Of course, the EFF, as you know, Mosa has done great research on the EFF, and others here have too. The EFF is this political party which is similarly class-focused, but not really class-rooted. And it's hard to tell if the political program that it presents is one that does seek genuine transformation in South Africa and a redistribution of wealth, or one that, continuous from the ANC's class project, is fundamentally concerned with indigenizing South African capitalism. Its complaint being not really with the fact that there's an unequal distribution of resources, but with who controls those resources, and preferring that to be black South Africans rather than the bogeyman of white monopoly capital. Increasingly also, we are seeing South Africa's middle class form the base of a lot of populist experiments, right-wing populist experiments. In Johannesburg, for example, Herman Mashaba, who in Dennis's description was the closest we had to an elected fascist, was someone who drew a lot of support from disgruntled urban middle class South Africans, who attributed the decay of the city to the mismanagement of immigration, to the mismanagement of crime, and so on and so forth. And so the rhetoric of sort of stemming immigration and being tough on crime is something that resonates deeply with a middle class that feels sort of down on its luck, that feels as if it was cheated in the post-apartheid political settlement. Obviously, this is not it's a generic characterization of a particular strand of a middle class in South Africa. But I do think what that suggests is it's worth thinking about how to politically organize the middle class in a new counter-hegemonic political project, and what role is assigned to a downwardly mobile middle class in South Africa, which is worth thinking about precisely because it occupies this precarious social location, right? It's not in that position comfortably, it's asset poor, it's one financial catastrophe away from destitution. So even though it does occupy a relatively privileged position in South Africa's highly unequal society, it does so extremely precariously. It doesn't really sit there comfortably, and so in many respects is not sort of remote from the concerns of poor and working class South Africans. How do you create a movement for collective provision which addresses this feeling of being sort of squeezed, lacking sort of assets, lacking resources, lacking security, lacking social provision, with privatization not only being a policy that is being single-handedly implemented by the ANC government, but one that does find appeal. Most South Africans don't trust the state. Most South Africans feel this tremendous pressure to access private schooling, private healthcare, private so on and so forth. How do you challenge that? How do you challenge the increasingly sort of normalized narrative of privatized social provision, which is particularly sort of pitched at South Africa's small middle class, particularly black middle class? So as far as the question of what was the historical significance of the Fallist movement, I'm not sure. I think it's something that deserves a lot more attention, but I do think it's relevant because it represents this kind of important moment in South Africa's post-apartheid political history in which the middle class and the aspirant middle class start to play this outsized political role. What the implications and reverberations of that has been since 2015 and 2016 up until now is unclear. But I think the 2024 elections, for example, would be decisive in sort of indicating where this social formation feels it can best find political expression. It's come of age, it's now in a position where it's feeling the pressures of the labor market, and wants to make decisions to secure its economic and political future. So I think that's where I'll leave it, and looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Will. I think you've given us a lot to think about, and we'll open it up for questions. But I wanted to, you reminded me when you were speaking of an experience I had at UCT. I was at UCT in 2015. I was finishing off my master's, and I was lecturing a lot of the undergrads who were very involved in these movements, including Kale. And I have this very vivid memory of a part of the student protest at UCT that you didn't mention so much, but which Trevor talked about last night, which was about the End Outsourcing campaign. So there was this campaign, UCT workers who were in the cafeteria, cleaning staff, security staff, had all been outsourced, right, to other companies. They were not considered to be staff at the university, and this had created a whole range of negative impacts on those people. And so the students had taken up this as part of this, I remember it as being the kind of a third phase, after the fees must fall thing, but I might be misremembering that. And I remember there was this big protest which was meant to be taking on the outsourcing campaign, and so it was students and also workers who had gathered in front of Azania House, and I think this memory I have indicates one part of the complexities of the student protest, and especially the kind of race and class politics of it. And so some people had said, and there's a lot to say about the politics of white students who were part of this that have some interesting things, but people had said, white students need to get together separately to talk about being white students in this protest. And so everyone's on the field, and all the white students go and sit in a circle and start talking about what it means to be a white student at this protest. And I remember finding the conversation, not what I wanted it to be necessarily, but I remember then turning around, and one of the black male workers had brought his chair, and he was sort of sitting behind us and watching, and he had the most confused look on his face. And as if he was like, what is happening here? And it just really stuck in my mind. I can see his face now, nearly a decade later, whatever it is. And I think it just really speaks to me about what the complicated and contradictory nature of the class and racial composition of, especially at somewhere like UCT, as opposed to somewhere like Fort Hare or whatever, how that politics played itself out. So thank you for reminding me of that. Maybe we want to open it up. I think maybe we'll take, if there are 2 or 3, is that okay, Will?
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah.
Mosa?
Thank you. I agree with your analysis and most aspect of it. 2 things. I think I do worry. Of course, the middle class now, especially highly indebted middle class and black in South Africa with inflation and so on, they're actually feeling the squeeze. And I think this has happened during COVID far more than ever before. And very vocal on the media, but there is a worry where this 30 years of democracy, what we started to see in the townships, is the implosion of the working class and the poor. Young black working class poor are actually, there is a drug epidemic that is happening in the townships and in these rural areas in various ways that has taken over fundamentally, that even if the middle class is vocal, they fail to actually capture the imagination of the hopelessness and the implosion that is happening in the townships that I cannot even fathom to actually explain unless you're actually in those moods where there's no service delivery, there's no electricity, there is no, in many cases, in the Free State and so on, when you drive around, there's not even a garage in some towns at all. That's how destitute and forgotten the poor have been. First. And I think the second thing that has happened is that with the left, the left ourselves, it's the student movement spoke about race. And traditionally, I think the failure of the left politics is the debate around race and class, orthodox Marxist comrades, when you spoke about race in anything, it's a very upsetting conversation, especially around the old guard Marxists that actually you can't relate. And EFF, then the fees must fall. And the old guard again of the left academics and so on, they wanted to say, oh, it's class is important, these are identity politics and so on, irrelevant, that actually the space was never there, and inherently it's not even there for the people in various ways. That became an issue. But, something is happening. The protest is still happening at universities every single year. And now the protest of university has moved from fees must fall to access to NAFSAs, which is the South African government-funded loan, for those who don't know, as the key demand every single time. How did that moment happen for me? From fees must fall to access to NAFSAs in a different way. But also, I want you to talk about the betrayal, a different betrayal of the leadership and the people who, middle class compared to working class kids who now find themselves at Brown universities and so on, and the others are left there at those universities unemployed. Others have become politicians and they're in legislatures. This another layer of betrayal, and how do we understand that? And I think, Ryan, you were there as well, at the Union Building, when the 0% moment was announced by Zuma. Now we say it's a different narrative, but it was a moment where everybody, he didn't come out, okay, at the Union Building. We got it on our Twitter account, he's announcing 0%. But then it created a division between the TUT and the VETs. For the first time in that moment, where TUT students were appealing for people to stay and fight, and they started burning toilets and so on, and the VETs they were out. They left, no violence, guys, UP and so on. We don't want violence versus the violent hooligan working class TUT. You will explain TUT. People who wanted to stay longer, historically black university thing. How do we explain these ruptures within also the movement as well?
Marcus.
Well, it was really insightful. One of the questions I wanted to ask is, some people connect the Fallist movement to this longer historical trajectory, thinking about the Black consciousness movement and Sleepy Goats and some of the ideas that are being shared. I'm wondering, to the extent that you buy that, that there is some connection between the Black consciousness movement, thoughts to Sleepy Goat and the Fallist movement. To what extent is that consistent with the sort of aspirational Black middle class dynamics you're describing, as opposed to being something in tension with that?
Do you want to take one more? Dennis? Yeah.
I was actually going to say something, or exactly what you were talking about, so about that day at the Union Buildings and the TUT students and the VIT students. And I'm glad you mentioned that there's this kind of longer running mobilization happening at universities that the Fallist movement comes out of. But I'm wondering if it seems like what you were saying about it is that there's something in this discussion about what shows up, in the, I think you were calling it about the social discourse. And I'm wondering if, as somebody at the helm of such a wonderful publication, you have something to say about what does, that process of what does show up at that level. I think, over the last day and a bit, there's been a whole bunch of remembering and nostalgia and what the UEF was, and Marikana comes up a lot. And then in all of that, there's a whole bunch of silences as well. That a couple of days after Marikana, they started burning farms into Durance, and 3 workers were killed there. And so, what is it about? So, and the other thing I keep thinking about is, in this whole tragic collapse of the left where we are. There seem to be these forms of organization happening outside that are far more flexible and aware to how work has changed in South Africa, or are ready to organize around the fact that work is now so deeply casualized in a way that this really seemingly laggard, slow union movement hasn't caught up to. So essentially, there's this whole bunch of kind of things that don't show up. I just wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
Great. Do you want to take those as well?
Yeah.
So we don't get to.
Yeah, these are great questions. I'll start with what Mosa is saying about kind of the implosion of sort of townships and working class communities and sort of the decay and collapse of the social fabric there, and sort of how to understand that. I don't have the answer. I think, part of the interest in sort of thinking about, and to be clear, part of the interest in thinking about the political role of South Africa's middle class is not to kind of attribute them primacy in political organization, but is to say that sort of the nature of the public sphere, and sort of to Dennis's point about what people do and don't care about, what people do and don't give attention to, is that this collapse and this decay has been sort of long-standing in South Africa's poor and working class communities. But now we're at this moment where, it's only when kind of middle class South Africans feel the pinch of state collapse and decay that there's any sort of conversation about how bad things are getting, when people in suburbs lack access to water and electricity for days. And kind of the question is sort of how do you, what is the scope for leveraging sort of that frustration and disgruntlement towards building a greater politics that is about sort of redistribution, capacitating the state to enable collective provision and so on and so forth. Because kind of the inverse of that is the capture of that middle class disgruntlement, disaffection, and discontent towards sort of right-wing politics, right? That kind of fans the flames of further deepened privatization, the kind of fortification of suburbs as these sort of islands of private provision, and just sort of the deepened segmentation of society along class lines. And I think we're at a very difficult moment precisely because of the picture you paint, Musa, about how the sort of gangsterization of communities and the extent of these problems poses a challenge on the one hand of, how do you organize against that? And I think on the other, and this is what the work of Trevor and other people show, there are sort of potentials there. There are people who are kind of self-organizing alternatives, self-organizing community provision, and so on and so forth. And those deserve attention too. I hope that kind of answers the question. And then to the sort of race and class debate, I don't have a sort of stake in the debate necessarily. I think I think what's relevant about that debate as it pertains to kind of the Fallist moment is, there is no kind of, in my view, there is a false dichotomy that is often sort of just received, where the two are treated as distinct when I think they're kind of interrelated modalities. The kind of old sort of classical Marxian idea that it's just class for me isn't sufficiently sort of enlightening. I think something that is worth part of the Fallist movement and part of the argument it's making wasn't just about exclusion, but was about sort of alienation, how these universities in their character, in their organizations, still embodied a very colonial way of looking at and understanding the world. And so for Black students finding themselves in those environments, it was just deeply estranging. You felt like a foreigner in your own country. And I think what I think is I think that feeling was politicized during Fees Must Fall, but I think it was also maybe kind of trapped oftentimes in too racialist a framework, I would say. And I think what was missing was the way in which that alienation and estrangement also overlaps with sort of the character of capitalism and injuries to body and psyche that are inflicted by capitalism, and have their source in the economic structure. And I think that the link to the economic structure was sort of missing, and it was discussed purely on culturalist terms as being this cultural phenomenon. So I think kind of, what does that mean? I think programmatically, I don't know if we see it yet, there needs to be a vocabulary to sort of address the injuries of capitalism that aren't necessarily material, but which at the same time can kind of draw attention to their material origins and to those material realities. And then, yeah, that scene from 2016, which is also kind of etched into my memory of, you know, the dynamic between the Wit students and the TUT students. I don't have much to say there, except I think it's sort of indicative of this sort of broader point about the illegibility of sort of poor and working class South Africans in the public sphere. And as I was saying earlier, the long history of mobilization on university campuses did not start at Wits and UCT, but it only got attention at Wits and UCT. And I think for me, the question there is sort of like almost to the point, almost a mirror image of the point Ryan was making earlier. I think that there's something about the South African political landscape where you kind of, in organizing to change that, in organizing to sort of address the silences and the ways in which sort of masses of people are kind of rendered invisible to the public sphere, in organizing to address that, how do you do so in a manner that accepts that this is just the way the public sphere in South Africa now operates? And I'm not sure how to do that. Is the frank answer that I can give. And then to Marcus's question about the historical lineage from Black consciousness to Fees Must Fall, I think it was very like unevenly applied. And I think I think like what's telling is the fact that it's completely sort of evaporated, that no one really organizes on those terms anymore. No one really sort of advances those arguments in order to characterize South Africa's political moment, at least in ways that we are seeing, right? I mean, I take Dennis's point very seriously that maybe I'm just not seeing it, maybe we're just not seeing it. But I think what that is expressive of is kind of precisely how, because it happened on the back of this so-called post-political, post-historical moment, I think students were on that scene trying to find ways of understanding the contemporary moment and drawing from all sorts of sources, all sorts of political traditions in an uneven fashion and relying on some more than others. But that kind of sort of intellectual production wasn't really sustained post that moment. And so I think now there's a kind of void of analysis where I not only think sort of Black consciousness in that political tradition, but even more classical Marxist political traditions are just, as far as I can tell, completely absent in South Africa's discourse as far as understanding the contemporary predicament is the best answer that I can give. And then Dennis, I hope I kind of answered your question in answering the other questions. I think you're absolutely right that there are ways in which we are blind to different experiments and sort of self-organization that are happening. And as someone who's at the helm of a publication that is interested in understanding where those are happening, I have no real way no real sort of protocol of ensuring that I capture it, because as much what I am exposed to is shaped in the first instance by the milieu that I'm in, and that comes with its blindnesses and sort of ignorances to things that are happening. I think, though, what that sort of, I think part of why I've learned so much from this conference is sort of hearing about the case studies undertaken by folks like Zach and Marcel and so on and so forth, how to give those great expression visibility. I think part of this kind of originates, once again, in sort of the disorganization and the demobilization of popular forces, which means that there's a breakdown in the sort of critical infrastructures of democracy. So even news media and the way we consume that, the complete absence of thriving community radio or community newspapers and those sorts of vehicles at a local level. I think the collapse of those is another ways in which people are kind of rendered illegible in the public sphere. How to revive that, I think, forms part of this bigger question of how to sort of repoliticize society in a way that polarizes social difference and that critiques the status quo.
Marcel, Zach, Ben, then we'll come to you first. And yeah, okay, cool. Start here. Marcel.
Yeah, thanks, Will. And it's great that you brought in this moment. Amazing that we, hadn't really touched it too much yet. Obviously, hugely important. I want to say two things. One was just sort of connecting a thread. I mean, you spoke about the historical defeat of the working class, and most of this sort of pointing to some of the activity that's happening in the township, and sort of the drug use and disillusionment. And just to draw a connection to the point that Trevor was making yesterday, that I was picking up on about this question of confidence. And it strikes me this is not to blame people. Obviously you get stuck in conditions of poverty, you're going to do what you're going to do. But it strikes me that there's a looming question. The future sort of hinges a little bit on the extent to which people can find that confidence, right? A sense of taking control of our own destiny, sort of thing, right? And that, for me, that's one of the breaks that needs to happen, right? And it strikes me as one that could potentially happen. As the ANC further crumbles, people stop waiting for the ANC to deliver, right? And start taking control. Okay, that's just one thing. The second thing is just kind of picking up on this other thread. Marcus asked about Pico, and most of made the point about sort of race, class, which you were speaking about. But a term that was quite big during the sort of Fallist moment was the idea of decolonization, and of course comes out of the Rhodes Must Fall portion of that movement, right? But it seemed to me to be spreading quite rapidly, that idea. And so I guess I want to put you on the spot a little bit to see, A, what do you recall people were saying about decolonization? Or B, what does it mean for you? What does decolonization look like? And it strikes me that, obviously, that's what happens when you're a keynote speaker. Yeah. But the reason why I pose it to you is because you seem like you're sort of pushing towards or moving towards, infusing sort of class analysis, right? Just sort of delivering a little bit of a critique, right? It's too much. There was an absence of sort of class politics, but you also just said that you didn't want to revert to that old class-only position, right? And it strikes me that language of decolonization, connecting to Biko as well in BC, right, provides a possible way into that, right? Of course, also connecting to some of the questions that Shannon was asking earlier. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah, so thanks for that, and I really want to commend the ambition and kind of scope in which you framed it, because I agree. I mean, often people don't talk about the student movement in this kind of way, and especially like the counterfactual framing. And, I was going to ask two things, but Marcel actually just asked the decolonization one, which was to ask about, whether we really can think of race and class as two separable demands. But I'll leave that one to the side. I wanted to push you a little bit on let's call it the void thesis. I really like this argument about the void and kind of the lack of intelligibility of working class demands. And I was thinking a lot about whether the problem is a void or actually kind of its opposite. Whether the fact that there is a kind of content there. And I was thinking about some of the conversations this morning about the fragmentation of organization and the way that what seem to be, or what begin as larger demands are often incorporated, to reduce it to that, but and wind up being essentially proletarian struggles over scarce resources. And so you have this kind of competitive hailing process through which people try to access these scarce resources, whether it's land, housing, services, etc. And whether that's not part of the problem. In other words, the fact that potentially working class demands may be too legible, to put it differently, that they're not intelligible in their form as, say, revolutionary demands or something like this, but become legible as immediate demands, something like this, and that winds up fragmenting then the working class. And we don't have anything like an organized working class. And so, I'm just thinking of when I was in Cape Town, it's probably 2016, and thinking about when Fallists from UCT were trying to connect with organizers in townships, and so there'd be these meetings in Khayelitsha, and it was always really awkward. I mean, the kinds of demands that they were trying to make weren't on the same planet.
Yeah.
I wanted to maybe pick up on the mirror image of what Zach was just talking about, because the Fallist moment, to the extent that it had a material demand, it was related to the growing indebtedness that character. There's a kind of economic sociology that's shifted that Fallism represented. And so this is kind of making me think, like, to talk about working class demands and class-based demands, material demands, there's a very different set of material demands that are emerging in the Fallist moment than prior kinds of material demands that were being made to kind of fuel the struggle against apartheid and in the early years after apartheid. And that has to do with debt. And the experience of debt is much more individualized than either workplace demands, workplace exploitation, or the kinds of goods of collective consumption that characterize place-based struggles in an earlier era. And perhaps it's that more individualized kind of material demand that lends itself to being articulated through the harms to the individual psyche that you were describing, Will. So, is this a different economic, sociological moment, or could we keep talking about continuities with earlier periods? And I'm just wondering, like, to what extent can we think of the Fallist moment as kind of crystallizing a much deeper shift in the economic sociology of South?
I think, do you want to take those three?
Yeah.
It's quite a lot already.
So I'll start with the question about decolonization. I think all of us kind of have an uneasy relationship to the term, because on the one hand, I think we can sort of recognize how, and it's not a reason to discount it, because every kind of term and every idea is to some degree susceptible to elite capture. But I think decolonization over the last 5 years has been particularly susceptible to elite capture, kind of the, hobby horses of like elite university departments who, I'm not gonna get into that. 'Cause I wanna, but I'm not gonna get into that. But, and I mean, I think there are a lot of people like I think
You're in the belly of the beast.
I'm in the belly of the beast. We've like some great people have kind of written about and critiqued the misappropriation of that term. Olufemi Taiwo's book Elite Capture does that. Bhakti Sringapore has written a great essay on that for Africa as a country. But I think it's a valuable term. I think it's a valuable term that kind of, I think, particularly kind of draws attention to the fact that capitalism as an economic system, as a form of life, can't be disaggregated from colonialism, right? And that the two are co-constitutive, and so to fight capitalism, you're also, in a sense, decolonizing the political and economic order. So I don't have strong views on that, to be honest. I suppose the question I have is sort of what does, to the question I also asked Ryan earlier, is like, what does a program for decolonization look like? How do you make that actual in sort of political organizing? I'm not really sure. So yeah, to be completely frank, I have no strong thoughts on sort of decolonization as a term and framework to understand the political predicament and to understand the project of undoing it. And I think, this particular political conjuncture that we find in with sort of genocide ongoing in Palestine, I think is particularly kind of represented how decolonization as a political project is crucial, just in the sense of how the international political order still follows sort of colonial lines and expresses colonial relationships. So yeah, I don't know, is the short answer. And then to Zach's point, I think it's a great point, and paradoxically, I think it occurs simultaneously. And I think, so on the one hand, when speaking about the illegibility of the working class, what I mean is sort of the absence of the working class as an organized political actor that influences contemporary politics, right? So their historic defeat has simply just meant that they're not in the conversation about, they're not agenda setting as far as the political conversation goes. At the same time, South Africa is this curious place where there is just this intense pervasiveness of sort of class-focused justification, kind of, in order to sort of legitimize political demand or a political project. There is this kind of sort of pressure to sort of do so on class-specific terms, even if it has nothing to even if it has nothing to do with actually sort of advancing kind of working class politics. So I think it's this, and it comes precisely from, I think, South Africa's anti-apartheid political heritage. I think what occurs alongside that also is this idea that, the masses kind of lay in wait, sort of just ready to receive the command, and then like the revolution is going to happen. But I think that's kind of indicative of the sort of demobilization and the depoliticization of working class in South Africa, rather than expressive of it. It's sort of, the articulation of working class demands, not by the working class and for the working class, is kind of what I think is happening a lot. I don't know if I've answered that question, but I think I need to also think about it and how they can be coexistent. Then to Ben's point, I think you make a really kind of strong and compelling point about how there's kind of a new economic sociological moment that is typified by indebtedness. I don't disagree with that. I would say that precisely because that's kind of obscured, the fact that this cohort of people's main sort of material sort of deprivation is this position of economic insecurity and indebtedness. I think that's obscured, and that's obscured precisely because of depoliticization and under-politicization, that the language for that material reality was out of reach. And so I still think the question is, like, how do you politicize indebtedness? How do you politicize indebtedness in a way that kind of lends itself to broader working class led campaign for social transformation? Because it affects everyone. Obviously, it affects everyone unevenly, but I think it has emancipatory potential to think about that in a way that creates solidarity rather than individuation, and I'm not sure how to do that. Hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Will. So I've already got Ryan, Patrick, Jill. Maybe we'll try to, we still got a bit of time, but maybe we'll try to take a fourth. And I also want to say, people in the outer ring, don't feel that this is a, we really want like everyone to feel that they can. Yeah. Okay. So that's the 4 now. We can go Ryan, and then and just try to maybe keep it, so we can get to everyone's things.
I mean, Marcel mentioned this morning, Katzenhausen, right? Urban trenches. I haven't read that book for a very long time, but it's kind of like I'm interested in kind of like softening some of the lines we're debating, right? It's kind of like South Africa follows this process of kind of like urban trenches in reverse, right? Whereas in America, the political machines kind of take control of the communities, and the labor unions don't really establish that kind of presence. In the 1970s, South Africa's labor unions do. For a while, they're kind of like leading the anti-apartheid movement. Right? But then basically 2 things happen. Right? The one is the color bar softens. Right? So there's the emergence of the black middle class, increasingly from the 1970s. Right? Another thing that happens is kind of the decline of the industrial economy. Right? So the labor unions kind of like wither in strength and so on. And this kind of happens before the transition to some extent, right? Like in the 1980s, this is when the middle class kind of starts to take control of the anti-apartheid movement through the civics and so on and so forth, right? And by the 90s, they're in command, and the labor unions are kind of like to some extent playing second string and so on, right? What happens then is like the ANC is effectively a middle class movement. Right? I mean, it's a coalition and so on and so forth, but like there's a sense in which like the black middle class comes into power in the state, at least in 1994. Right? And so partly, like what we're seeing is not this kind of like the emergence of the kind of middle class for the first time, but rather what's happening is a fraction of the middle class is starting to break off from the ANC, and this is partly what you're seeing in the student movement. Another feature of that is like, the labor unions, I mean, it's not this thing where the labor unions are just entirely demobilized and they just disappear from the scene, right? They're in government, right? There's a, I'll work with them. Like there's, they have easy access to kind of government policy making processes, and to the extent that they have the capacity to engage in those policy processes, they can be very influential, right? Maybe not so much on macroeconomic policy and such, but like on a range of other things, they make their interests known, and often quite effectively. Right? And this is partly why COSATU doesn't just make a break, because there's real concessions that are being made constantly. Right? I don't know where that leaves me, but that was just my thought.
More of a comment than a question. Very South African left. Patrick.
So we've talked about all these sort of interesting rupture moments, Marikana, the Fees Must Fall, the NUMSA moment, and then they quickly sort of fizzle. There's a moment we haven't talked about, which was the reaction to state capture and the ultimate downfall of Zuma. And, maybe it's not that consequential, but in terms of a public sphere moment, it was kind of interesting, right? There was a lot of work done to expose state capture and the whole Gupta-Zuma nexus. And so I guess the simple question there is, what does that tell us about the middle class? Do we need to rethink that moment? Because certainly some elements of the middle class were essential, the more professionalized, the media, the researchers, the parties, et cetera, the academics clearly played a role in there. And we were talking about corruption as this, moralistic, I mean, it can be used to expose the perversions of the state and capture, et cetera. And that was clearly such a moment in sort of interesting ways. And maybe the more things change, the more they stay the same. And it's Ramaphosa now, we know he's stuffing millions of dollars away in his couches, et cetera. But is there something we can draw out of that? And this is building exactly on Ryan's comment, but putting it into comparative perspectives. Talking about the middle class, I mean, definitionally, it's always a mess, right? 90% of Americans call themselves middle class. It's a completely useless class category in that respect. But if we're talking about the credentialed middle class, as you were in the Fees Must Rise movement, what's really striking to me, what?
You said fees must rise, Patrick, which is an interesting Freudian slip.
What's really striking about that element of the middle class is how goddamn fickle it is, right? So on the one hand, it's part of these sort of nationalist democratic movements. It's true in India, it was true in Brazil. We forget, Lula, when he's first elected in 2002, is largely elected by the middle class. And the Indian National Congress, the secular, democratic, incredibly successful state formation project is driven by a largely English-speaking, urban, professionalized middle class. The middle class in Brazil then ended up voting for Bolsonaro, or big chunks of it, right? And the social base of the BJP, one of the most radical ethno-nationalist right-wing reactionary movements in the world, is entirely supported by that same professional middle class. And so what I'm trying to get at is, structurally speaking, in the Indian middle class, it was ready to be reactionary because it's upper caste. And especially around education, as lower castes started making their ways into higher education, the Indian upper caste middle class revolted. And likewise, it's very clear a lot of the middle class support in Brazil for Bolsonaro was in reaction to Lula's affirmative action policies, which were really successful in terms of diversifying the university. So I'm just trying to, in light of those comparisons, to think through what are the structural characteristics of the black middle class in South Africa that might make it, more or less potentially reactionary.
So, well, I want to thank you for a really wonderful talk and for me very provocative. And just two quick things that sprang to mind and then a sort of a reflection. So the first is in 2016, I actually crunched some numbers and discovered that actually as a proportion of the budget, that South Africa in fact devotes relatively small proportion to tertiary education. I wrote a little paper about it, which I'd be happy to send you. The second thing is, when I went, I didn't go back to South Africa in 20 and 21, but when I went back in 22, Wits had turned into a prison.
Yeah.
You cannot get into Wits. And on one occasion, I didn't have my Wits ID card. It took me close to half an hour. I had to literally beg to get in, pull out every bit of ID I had on me. I'm an old white lady. I mean, give me a break. But no, the tragedy, but colleagues at Wits talk about how this is a tragedy. Because what it means is that the prospects of using university spaces are radically curtailed. The minute there's a whisper of any sort of protest, there are internal gates now that clamp down at Wits. Yeah. It's a bloody prison, yeah? And the tragedy is precisely that, the imperative for decolonizing knowledge has to be done dialogically, relationally, yeah? And the spaces within which that happens are crucial. And just, quickly, it seems to me the thrust of the conversation, or one of the important thrusts of this conversation, is how do we think the relations between race and class? And I think part of what happened around the decolonizing knowledge was that and this is where language becomes so crucial, the language of intersectionality became very dominant. And intersectionality is a completely unrelational, undialectical concept. And something I've noticed after, many, many, many years of doing reading groups with both English-speaking and African language-speaking students, is that English-speaking students find it very difficult to wrap their minds around dialectical ways of thinking, whereas students who speak African languages get it immediately. And it just seems to me there's incredible potential for a more sort of critical dialectical way of thinking that gets away from crude understandings of dialectics, but really thinks in a deeply relational way that might be useful for organizing.
Thanks, Joel.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. I'm curious about the question about decolonization again, to follow the thread. And I think one of the real limits of Olufemi's analysis is it seems to lack an account of how elite capture, so to speak, is predicated not only on the insinuation of capitalism into identitarian politics, but through the concerted demilitarization of Black politics. And so I'm wondering how we can think of decolonization or the kind of capture of decolonization as a part of the disarticulation of decolonial movements from militancy and use of force. So how do we reframe or think about, or what would it mean to reframe or think about decolonization as not merely the decolonization of, say, school or knowledge systems, but actually the forced removal of settlers, about the redistribution of resources, et cetera, and so on, armed resistance. Again, and this is again a follow from yesterday, but again, I'm curious about the status and more plain way to put in question of violence and how violence may be the answer that is not necessarily on the table.
Well, so we've got 10 minutes, so we probably won't have time for another round of questions. So I'm wondering if there's questions, and in particular by people who might not be with us at dinner or tomorrow and might not have a chance to have this kind of conversation with people. I'd like to prioritize those if possible, if there are people who have things. If not, don't feel pressure, but if there are. Oh, okay, yeah, follow up. Thoughts?
I guess, to be more precise, I guess, I was thinking about yesterday in the stoking of anger and rage. And again, how, if we're going to talk about the relationship between race and class, historically, at least in the States, a major issue that made race and class not seem like a unified or a unified struggle is precisely kind of the way in which the white working class could not relate to the strategies, the violent strategies of slaves and of abolitionists. So when it became about questions of burning down buildings or of destroying plantations, white settlers could not get on board with that. White planters cannot get on board with that because that actually would overturn the very terms of their own class position, even if that class position was at the bottom of a kind of planter hierarchy. So again, to just historicize that relationally, I'm wondering how do we center, or what is the uses of violence in our movements for if decolonization should be, seems to be a question that the question of class and race might problematize or vex.
Okay. Well, and just to say that everyone here is very welcome to come tomorrow, in which we have an entire session dedicated to wrapping up, and people would be able to, talk about any of the themes, and everyone who's here is like very welcome to attend the whole morning tomorrow. Well, you have 8 minutes
to give all the answers.
Please.
To Ryan's observation, I think that's both. I think it's true, but in a limited sense, in the sense that the labor movement isn't, completely marginal or absent from political decision making. But I think it's one kind of strata of South Africa's labor movement. It's COSATU in the tripartite alliance, mostly representing public sector workers, and someone else made the observation about how there is this growing chasm between public sector unionists and union members and the rest of the working class, which includes the unemployed and the casually employed. And I think it's questionable as to whether they feel represented by COSATU, whether COSATU and its sort of labor aristocracy is even working class to begin with. So that's kind of like just a counter observation to make there. I'm not sure where that leaves either of us. And then to Patrick's point about the structural location of South Africa's middle class and whether it could be a base of reaction, I'm not sure. I think the one kind of difference in South Africa is that the black middle class is very small. So as to whether or not that could be a basis upon which to sort of launch a reactionary political project, I'm not entirely sure if that's possible. I think what's also interesting though is that, at the same time as it's small, it also has this kind of outsized political influence. And so I think this election is going to be instructive in demonstrating where those allegiances are lying and what kind of recomposition might take place afterwards and in which direction. As far as I can tell, it doesn't seem as if, there's a lot of kind of, and also almost to the observation Musa was making earlier, there is sort of reactionary sentiment kind of hovering in working class communities, but I don't get the sense that will be the base for maybe a reactionary kind of far-right populist movement, but also can't see that emerging from the black middle class, at least not yet. And, if it does, kind of forming what coalition? Because there's also kind of animosity between sort of the black middle class and the white middle class, who increasingly are kind of participating in a hidebound politics of trying to find sort of refuge from the South African masses through the DA or the Freedom Front Plus. And then to your point about, what did this rupture in reaction to state capture, what did that represent? I'm not sure. I think it partly represented kind of the politicization of the white middle class in South Africa. In what direction, I'm not sure, but, it was aptly, we all remember those two white grannies kind of chanting, Zuma must fall.
That's what I've been thinking about the whole time since Patrick's
Yeah, kind of borrowing from the language and tactics and vocabulary of fees must fall. Where that is now, kind of not really sure. I mean, obviously, I think a lot of white middle class South Africans are completely divorcing from society, kind of building their own enclaves of privatized provision and sort of increasingly being sort of charmed by the Freedom Front Plus and other right-wing parties that are kind of presenting this idea of decentralized government and self-sufficiency and self-provision, escaping the nightmare of the South African state and the failed experiment of multiracial democracy. Again, I think knowing where the numbers for that are, we'll have to wait until May to tell exactly. And then, to Jill said, I think those are great observations. And absolutely, this is part of the tragedy of the moment, is that the South African government devotes a fraction of its budget to tertiary education. It could devote more, but to Musa's observation earlier, which I didn't respond to, is that, you know, there's no one kind of making that argument, no one making that claim on the state, no one making those demands. The imaginary horizon of student protest has kind of shrunk and is only kind of touching on exclusion from NSFAS, and fees falling, universities decolonizing are not on the table at all. And as university campuses themselves are also securitizing, that's not on the table at all. You know, even in this moment, like another kind of tragic sort of indicator of the sort of regression of South African universities is, you know, the question of Israel-Palestine. You know, universities across South Africa refusing to take on boycotts, divestments, and sanctions, censoring students who are organizing Palestine solidarity on campus, and seeing that is just, it's very difficult to reconcile with the experience of 2015 and 2016, which is part of why I think it's worth kind of reflecting on what's happened, and I obviously don't have the answers for how that has happened, and I think, yeah, what you say about exploring dialectical frameworks in different languages, I think is crucial, and yeah, I agree with that. And then, yeah, your question. Yeah, I mean, first, I can't speak to the American context because I don't think I know enough, to be honest, but I think to your broader question about the role and place of violence, which I think is, you know, another sort of question that's reemerged recently. You know, I'm not settled on a particular position here, and think, you know, Fanon, one of the ways in which he is illuminating is on the question of violence, and I think a point he makes is that, you know, violence is a political strategy and tactic, but it must also be connected to considerations about what kind of society you want to build after the violence, and so I think that's something that's determined not on necessarily all the time on moral terms, as other people have said, but on political, strategic terms. And I think that question can only be answered on a case-by-case basis, is what I'll say.
Thanks, Will. You did very well. You got 1 minute to spare. So thanks, everyone. I think this was a really wonderful day. Super happy. Thanks to everyone for bringing so many great insights. And just to reiterate that we will be here in this room tomorrow morning from like 9:30. There'll be coffee and like breakfast. From 10 o'clock we'll start talking. So we really welcome everyone coming and being part of it. Tomorrow we'll be talking initially about party dynamics and the tripartite alliance, which we've pretty much been talking about the whole time, but we'll be explicitly talking about this. And then we will have some time for closing discussion with lunch, in which people will be able to bring any of these things or any questions that you didn't get to answer. So thanks, everyone. Thanks very much. Thank you
I'm sorry you had that experience. I had the same, but a little easier. Look, I mean, it was incredibly destructive. And in terms of the role of violence, it's hard to say it's a positive because actually.
and just to reiterate, the shuttle is picking people up right down, and we'll leave the hotel at 6:40. So the shuttle is downstairs. I think when you got dropped off, yeah, it's now. But the really big deadline is 6:40 outside the A-Loft with dinner. You won't be late. You will be left behind. Now you can.
Well, I mean, I thought that I'm speaking tomorrow.
Very academic.
That doesn't have much wrong with it. That doesn't, you know what I mean? Like that's just. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. It was great.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah, I'll come tomorrow just to talk. I'm Jordan. Nice to meet you. And thank you for your work on
an article version.
I had my card.
And some student wrote on this forum.
Yeah, I mean, Carly, are you going with the shuttle? Good question.
I mean, so I was like, A, this is very sexist because then
Drop my laptop off and then get me over it because I live right there.
and you know, she's like,
Does the driver need to know? No, I don't. The bus is just going to go at some point.
yeah. But so what I said is, you should just tell them.
Dave, what are you doing?
It is cold.
Apparently, we're having dinner.
Yes, so you could walk there, yeah, or you can take the bus there now, or you can drive. You can go and park and all of the above.
Can we do the
Sure, right. I mean, that's the same.
Yeah, because that way when we click back, the big car. Let's see if it can be there.
Yeah. I agree.
I have a good parking car. Plus it's early. So it's probably Yesterday we parked right there.
Which was very useful.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. I was a little more kind of restrained because I didn't know. But anyway.
Happy to be done with it.
Yeah.
No, just like drink, have a good time.
Strong position on decolonization. I was like, oh.